Good evening, everyone. Volume is a little bit odd on this. Give it a few for people to wander in, just because different location and yeah, so we'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First, apologies for the room change. Apparently, they overbooked the capacity of the other room. But honestly, other than a strange angle, this room's quite a lot nicer than the other one. Quick question though, just in terms of future reference, in terms of choice between, say, this classroom, the lecture theater at CCLS at Lincoln's Inn Fields, or a theater at Mile End, can I just get a show of hands which you prefer? So hands for Mile End? So about a third, okay. Hands for Lincoln's Inn Fields? Okay. And hands for Charterhouse Square. Okay, so it looks like the preference is Mile End. All right, but for this class, we're locked into this one, but I'll know for next year for future reference. All right, so attendance code up here, I'll put it back up at the break as well. What I want to look at is sources of international commercial law, this idea of making commercial law. And the key point, and it's one that we're going to come back to repeatedly, is when we look at the world economy, commerce on a distance or a cross-border basis is by no means new. And many of the challenges which we're going to see are consistent over time. What changes are the ways that we try to deal with those. As we talked about last time, sometimes legal and institutional, sometimes technological. And certainly, if one is interested in this topic, very interesting book published a couple of years ago called 1177 BC. And essentially what this is a book about is we see a major collapse of the global economy at the end of the Bronze Age. Now, what that actually means, and when we look at not only archaeological history, but also things like shipwrecks, what we find is that in this period that we call the Bronze Age, bronze is basically an alloy of a number of metals, including copper. But if we look at major areas for the development of historical civilizations, if we look at China, we look at India, we look at West Asia, we look at the Mediterranean, copper is not actually that common. Copper typically would have to be shipped from somewhere else. So we're already seeing 2,000 years before year zero, BCE, common methodology, before the Common Era, ships, insurance, financing, sales, and issues of money and payment. And it's interesting that we begin to see particularly some of these legal tools that we're going to be looking at across the course developing from a very early stage. Now, we see this civilizational collapse, and one thing that happens, and of course it's comparatively interesting if we think about some of the circumstances today, we see that for a variety of reasons, that system of international trade, which took place largely across what we would think of as West Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, when that system collapsed, we see essentially major damage to economies, civilizational structures. And that's something that when we see these periodic collapses in cross-border commercial linkages, typically that results in negative consequences for the richest major economies of whatever period one is looking at. One sees essentially a return, and if we look at, one can think of it as the classical period. We can think of Qin and Han Dynasty in China. We can think about the Roman period in particular in the Mediterranean, Persia, various Indian empires in between. During this period, we have significant volumes of commerce. And in addition to natural resources, which is going to be a theme, things like copper in particular, we see large volumes of trade in grains and agricultural goods. And once again, the sorts of mechanisms which we see around ships, insurance, contracts, finance, payments, all relatively similar. Once again, we see in, if one wants to think about in particular, the Islamic period, we see the emergence of similar sorts of trading patterns. And if we look at the modern period, we can certainly say that the end of the 19th century is in many ways the beginning of many of our processes of international commercial law. And certainly, at least one of the organizations that we're going to be coming back to periodically, the Hague Conference on Private International Law, is established at the end of the 19th century. And we see across the 20th century a range of different mechanisms developed to try to support international commerce. And if we want to think about the sorts of themes, and we'll be using a fair number of examples and news stories, and the sorts of commercial areas that I'll try to pick up on, one is going to be copper. Why? Because if we think about trade in copper, this has been one of the most important international commercial trades since at least 2000 BCE. And up to the present day, copper is one of our most important industrial metals. It goes into almost everything that we think of today, and there are, it's available in a range of places, but there are a small number of places where large volumes of copper are available. And we've developed a variety of mechanisms to support that trade. Another area that we see very much from earliest days is trade in luxury goods and manufacturers. This is something that always one sees small, high-value things that can be easily transported. And that remains the case today. We'll actually pick up a fair amount on textiles. Textiles not necessarily small or high value, but we see lots of trade in textiles, and this is something that relates to a variety of other industries. Food. We're going to look at food, and in particular, we'll probably pick up on wheat a lot. In fact, I'll look at some of the arrangements in wheat in just a few minutes, but also pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals is a major manufacturing industry that a lot of different sorts of standards go into, and it takes us into a range of interesting transport mechanisms. Obviously, consumer goods and electronics. And we'll be looking in particular at telephones. iPhone makes a very nice example of many of these commercial processes, particularly as we think about supply chains. Equipment. Equipment is something that tends to be traded, and often when we think about international commerce, we're thinking about things like cars, aircraft, diggers. But it's also the case that because of the frequency of trade in these sorts of things, I really hate this, we have a variety of specific, we have a variety of specific legal systems and structures that have developed to facilitate trade in things like equipment. Energy. This is one that we're going to pick up on over and over, because at the end of the day, from the standpoint of modern economies and modern societies, energy underlies pretty much everything that we do. And it's an area where we're seeing some very interesting competitive processes between traditional energy systems like fossil fuels and new sorts of energy systems such as solar cells, nuclear fusion, and other forms. And we'll obviously pick up on semiconductors from a fair range of different angles. If we want to think, and I want to come back to where I left us at the end of last time, if we're thinking about a commercial transaction, the easiest, simplest is your instant transaction. But that instant transaction is not necessarily that easy to make happen. And as a result, many of our mechanisms are designed to address various aspects of time, distance, and risk, different combinations of legal and institutional tools along with different technological frameworks. The ability to address time, distance, and risk in an effective manner allows the development of more complex systems and higher levels of specialization. In other words, if we think about something like your smartphone, this smartphone has at its base a range of chips. Those chips are made from silicon and a variety of metals, which have to be mined and sourced from a range of places around the world. They have to be taken, they have to be refined, and in particular, if we're thinking about things like silicon, the level of refining is really quite amazing. We also have other components such as the lenses in the camera, the glass cover, the aluminum case. All of these different pieces tend to be made by different pieces, different participants in the commercial chain. And that is a process of specialization. At the end of the day, Adam Smith's core contribution is this idea that trade allows specialization in certain things, which allows individuals or firms to be particularly good at certain pieces. The complexity comes from bringing all of those pieces together into a single thing and delivering it to whoever it is that is actually looking to buy it, wherever they may be. And as we discussed last time, also arranging the payment to arrive from wherever that may be to wherever it is destined to come. And the systems, at the end of the day, are designed to increase predictability. Predictability over time allows, essentially, it's a form of trust. You can trust that if you have a contract to deliver a chip made in a certain way, at a certain place, at a certain time, you depend, you trust that that will actually arrive. That predictability enables the, if you will, putting together of complex commercial transactions, which in many ways are at the basis of our global economy today. In addition to predictability and trust, one is also looking to reduce costs of transactions, to increase efficiency, to make it commercially viable to do different things because of our various mechanisms. Now, this is, if one wants to look at this, this is a sort of diagram of Apple's supply chain. And one can think about pieces. One can think about the design and engineering. But the design and engineering is central to the production of the eventual product. And increasingly, we're actually seeing the design and construction, not just a simple piece about putting all the pieces together, but increasingly actually designing things like the chips, the GPUs, the processors that actually go in, and working with manufacturers like TSMC to produce the specific chip components that are necessary to maximize the performance to deliver the good which is being designed and sold. One can think about, I've mentioned primary materials. One can think about gold, copper, aluminum. There was a funny story in Bloomberg today about, because gold prices have gone up so much, you actually have gold in a range of semiconductor chips. And so you now have a variety of businesses around the world which are taking old chips and extracting the gold from those chips, because even if the chip is no longer worthwhile, the gold that is embedded in it has value. And if one is thinking about 5,000 US dollars an ounce of gold, 32 grams, it may take a while to get that out of chips, but it's a valuable commodity. We often see when copper prices are high, similar sorts of things. Not uncommon to see thefts of things like electrical wires, which have historically been made out of copper when copper prices are very high. Steal the wires, melt down the copper, sell the copper in the context of realizing the price. So primary materials, the smelting and refining. And this is something that we see even specialized. If we look at something like oil, there are different refiners who specialize in different types of oil. In other words, if you are taking over Venezuela, for instance, the oil that you're getting may not be suitable for the nearest refineries. And so one has to think from the standpoint of specialization. We've moved to a point where we can have sufficient specialization that refineries may only deal in one grade of crude oil from a certain location. Components. Obviously, when we think about supply chains, this is what we're typically thinking about. The idea of taking a variety of different components, putting those together into something that is more valuable than the sum of the pieces. And this, if we're thinking about firms, a lot of firms specialize in the pieces. If we think about Germany, or we think about Japan, we have manufacturers who are famous for building certain types of electric motors. If you need a certain specialized type of electric motor, there are manufacturers who will make this specific type. Morocco produces a lot of electric motors. And so this is something that if you think about buying all of the various components, you have firms that specialize in each type of component. One issue that we're going to see coming up over the course a number of times is a complexity around automobile supply chains. Now, think about this. An electric car like a BYD versus a petrol car like a BMW. They both look pretty much the same, and if you're sitting in one, they seem functionally equivalent, and from the standpoint of driving, not necessarily that different. But if we think about the components of that petrol BMW versus that electric BYD, they're completely different. Yes, both have tires. Yes, both will have bodies, both will have interiors. But if we look at the major, biggest single component of the BYD, what do you think? What's the biggest single component of that BYD? Semiconductor, yes, but it's actually made into something specific. Yeah, whoever said lithium battery. That battery is the single biggest, heaviest, most expensive component in that BYD. How about the BMW? It's the engine. But there's a big difference between a highly engineered petrol engine and a giant lithium battery. And if you think about it from a supply chain standpoint, those suppliers that supply the engines and all of the related materials for the BMW, they have absolutely no role in the BYD. And this is something that is quite interesting, because if we are thinking about these two competing technologies, they are fundamentally different supply chains. How you build them, how you put them together, very different. Now, of course, the sales, distribution, and delivery are actually going to be very similar between the BMW and the BYD. We will see certain differences, but in many cases, very similar. Final assembly, which of course, for many things over recent decades, China has emerged as the major location for final assembly. But of course, we are seeing a major trend around the world where countries are trying to increase domestic manufacturing and to move away from that sort of single point of final assembly or single point of supply for any component in the supply chain. Logistics. How do you get the thing from place to place? And this is something where, if we think about in the 19th century, it was basically ships and trains. Today, ships, yes, continue to play a very important role. But shipping is one of those industries that likewise is changing very, very rapidly. And we'll come to a story on that in just a minute. But we also see very heavy use, particularly of aircraft delivery for pieces. Aircraft, in particular, delivery of things has become far cheaper than it was a couple of decades ago. And this has meant that economically, it's easier in many cases for small, high-value things to use aircraft delivery rather than sea delivery. And that brings with it different components. The retail store could be retail, could be wholesale. Many of the things we're looking at in this course are actually wholesale, business-to-business transactions. But at the same time, we will look at a range of retail. Increasingly, we're seeing interrelations with a variety of services. Look at that a little bit less. And we're also, remember my chip example, taking the gold out of it, recycling is something that may be sold from the standpoint of marketing to customers who desire that, or as a result of regulatory requirements, but we're also seeing it increasingly from extracting the economic value out of things which have been produced and of which are no longer being used. Now, if we want to think about trends, a couple that clearly we're going to pick up on. Crises, regulation, technology, multipolarization, this tension between globalization and fragmentation, and the new one that we're starting to pick up, demographics. What I want to do here is kind of, in each week, you'll get a slide which has a range of stories that I've found interesting over the past week or so between our classes. And typically what we'll do is we won't go through all of these in one place, but we'll pick up a few now. Then we'll go on to another section where we look at something. And then probably after the break, we'll pick up a few more and a few more. A couple that I wanted to pick up right off. The first one, shipping. And of course, this is, from the standpoint of dispute resolution, something that we're going to look at later in the course. But this is a very interesting combination of geopolitics, commerce, and dispute resolution. And essentially what we have is we have a large Hong Kong company called Hutchison that owns a lot of logistics providers around the world. Its origin was simply a shipping logistics company in late 19th century Hong Kong, shipping things back and forth between China and the West. And over time, it has specialized in owning things like ports and airports. And one thing that it had done was it had purchased essentially a contract to run the main ports in Panama. With geopolitical tensions increasing in recent years, this has become a major touch point, in particular, between the US and China about what sort of role or control Hutchison actually has in the context of the Panama Canal. And we've seen a variety of different aspects contesting the role and a variety of efforts by Hutchison actually to sell not only its Panama port, but actually to sell all of its global ports business. And this is a very recent decision from a court in Panama that the contract whereby the Panamanian government contracted Hutchison to run the port is actually illegal under the Panamanian Constitution. And so we're now seeing a variety of dispute processes around what is a very commercial activity, running one of the world's major ports, but as a result of geopolitical changes, a transaction around running a commercial port has become a major focus of political tensions. We'll probably see this one a bit more as we get towards the dispute resolution side. I'm actually going to pick up this time a couple of quotes, a couple of pieces straight from Sai Shen. And this one is we're seeing a lot of discussions around the Arctic, in particular issues around Greenland have received a lot of attention recently. One of the reasons for that is there is a view which is that climate change is reducing the level of ice in the Arctic. And that is making a variety of commercial opportunities potentially viable in a way which they weren't previously. Some of it has to do with primary materials like minerals and other sorts of things. Other aspects, and that's what this article is about shipping and the ability to use geography to cut shipping costs as a result of climate. So, Arctic shippers navigate choppy commercial waters despite geopolitical push. On 13 October, the ship Istanbul Bridge docked at Britain's largest container port, marking the first complete voyage along a Chinese company's new sea freight route through the thawing Arctic. And so if we look at this picture, and one thing that you don't quite get from a flat picture is the roundness at the top. And the roundness is the key to distances. And if one is thinking about normal shipping routes from, say, Eastern China to Europe, one route would be to go down to Singapore and across from Singapore up through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean and on to typically either London or Rotterdam for a variety of historical reasons. Obviously, we're seeing a variety of issues around the Suez Canal and its risks, but it also happens that if one is thinking about this, this is pretty close to the equator, so this is about the longest route you could take. The other route one could do is you could go straight across from eastern China to the Panama Canal and up from the Panama Canal to Western Europe. That would be another route. But what we can see from this route is that essentially you're going up in between Russia and Alaska, over the top of Russia, down to the top of Western Europe. And essentially, the Istanbul Bridge made the trip from Ningbo-Zhoushan port in eastern China to the port of Felixstowe on England's east coast in just 20 days. The trip could have been shorter if the ship had been able to run at a faster speed. It could be done in 18 days. Even at 20 days, the route is far faster than existing options. Traditionally, trade between China and Europe has relied on shipping via the Suez Canal, a 40-day voyage through the Red Sea, or the China-Europe Railway, which takes around 25 days through Russia. So in other words, if one is able to use the Arctic route, one saves from the standpoint of the traditional sea route via the Suez Canal, one saves half the time. And that is a big savings from the standpoint of costs, but also times of arrival. And so, from the standpoint of a lot of the political activity we're seeing around the Arctic, a lot of it is related to the reality that we are now seeing possibilities for commercial shipping, which then has impacts on a variety of other transactions. But shipping cargo via these routes has gotten complicated in recent years. The rail route is hampered by growing tensions between Europe and Russia over the war in Ukraine that started in 2022, and ships using the Suez Canal run the risks of attacks by Houthi rebels in Yemen, which abuts the Red Sea. New Arctic route provides a more secure sea passage between China and Europe. And we now have a number of essentially chartered regular routes. And if we want to think about that point around distance and predictability, much of our shipping is regular routes. In other words, we often think about, you want to ship goods from China to Europe, you're chartering a ship, and it's taking your goods. You are, but generally speaking, you are taking space on a ship that is going on a regular schedule. And that means that the price of space on that ship is a commodity that has been commoditized largely by, in many cases, the availability of standardized shipping containers, which enable the commoditization of space on regularly chartered ships. We see similar arrangements with bulk carriers that carry things like oil or grain or coal or iron. And so these new sea routes exemplify a broader search for Arctic alternatives driven by geopolitical tensions and Western sanctions that have disrupted traditional trade routes for countries like China and Russia. However, even as melting sea ice makes the passage easier to navigate, the commercial viability of Arctic routes remains in question. A combination of safety risks, higher costs, a short shipping season, and tepid customer demand has limited their appeal. And this is something that obviously when we're thinking about commerce, we always have to think about the commercial realities. Yeah, it's shorter, but are there other reasons why it's not as desirable? And in many cases, we may be actually then thinking Are there mechanisms whereby we can manage or control those risks to deal with that distance, that time, to reduce risks, increase predictability, lower transaction costs, to enhance the commercial attractiveness? Commercial challenges. The Arctic route's economic value hinges on a combination of factors, including vessel type, port accessibility, navigable months, and geopolitical risks. Noting shippers are currently most concerned about getting their cargo to its destination safely and reliably. Not surprising. There are obstacles to both safety and reliability. For one thing, routes are only open 4 months out of the year, from July to November. The sailing period we have chosen does not require icebreakers, but if we want to enter earlier or leave, we may have to use icebreakers, which is a cost. Even without icebreakers, floating ice remains a threat, along with poor visibility for heavy fog. To help deal with the complications, Sea Legend has provided crew members with specialized training, modified vessel structure, and outfitted it with better radar. Caution can be found amongst the shippers themselves. So, this is something that when one is thinking about these combinations of geopolitics, of technology, of sustainability, sometimes they are making new opportunities available, and sometimes we're trying to figure out ways where we can make those new opportunities more viable. Pick up a couple more. One more. This one we'll pick up next week. Hong Kong targets first stablecoin licenses in March, so that's next month. Hong Kong aims to issue its first batch of stablecoin issuer licenses in March, with an official saying only a small number of applications will be approved initially. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is Hong Kong's central bank and payments regulator, is assessing applications and has requested additional information from some applicants, including details on use cases, risk controls, and reserve asset composition. The plan follows the implementation of the Stablecoins Ordinance in August, part of Hong Kong's push to build a regulated framework for digital assets. The HKMA received applications from 36 institutions by the 30 September deadline, spanning banks, technology firms, securities brokers, asset managers, e-commerce platforms, payment providers, and Web3 companies. Standard Chartered Bank, one of the city's 3 note-issuing banks, is widely seen as a strong contender after joining the HKMA's stablecoin sandbox in mid-2024. Now, that's the interesting piece here. Standard Chartered. Why would Standard Chartered be interesting here? Well, for this course, Standard Chartered is one of the world's largest trade finance providers. It's one of the world's largest cross-border payments providers. And so, if it is actually going to launch a new payment option, this is something that is potentially directly relevant from the standpoint of quite a large portion of global commerce. So this is something that, as I said, we'll pick up next week when we look at money and payments side. But it's something that we're starting to see some of these instruments like stablecoins. Standard Chartered is one of the world's largest banks. As I said, it's one of the largest payment providers. It's also one of the world's largest trade finance providers. And so that means that one can expect going forward, if one is in commerce to have choices from the standpoint of payments technologies, legal mechanisms, and we're seeing an increasing desire for choices of currency. And that's something that we'll pick up on next week. One more on today's, this one. Asia Pacific emerges as global hotspot for high-tech identity fraud. This is actually one of the biggest problems that we're running into in all sorts of areas. Sophisticated fraud cases involving advanced technology, social engineering, and artificial intelligence surged 180% globally in 2025 compared to the previous year, as criminals increasingly deploy high-tech methods to bypass security systems. The Asia-Pacific region has emerged as the fastest-growing area for these risks, witnessing a sharp transformation in criminal tactics towards complex identity theft rather than simple opportunistic scams. Penny Chai, SumSub's vice president for the Asia-Pacific region, noted that fraud patterns in the region are shifting from instant profit seeking to attacks aimed at seizing control of target user identities and accounts. Data from the report supports this observation, indicating that for individual users in the region, the primary consequence of fraud is now account takeover. Now, what do we essentially see? 2 years ago, there was quite a famous example of a company. It happens to be in Hong Kong, but the company, essentially the CFO, the Chief Finance Officer, receives an email from the management committee that they are going to have a directors meeting to discuss a financial issue. It includes a link to an online meeting. He, and it is a he in this case, duly joins the meeting. There is a discussion involving the CEO and a number of other seniors, and a direction to the CFO to make a transfer of $25 million to an account. The CFO, after the call ends, goes and makes the transfer and finds out pretty quickly after that this was a deep fake. In other words, the video of the CFO was full-on deep fake. And this is something that increasingly we're seeing in the commercial world, is a rule which says don't transfer money without face-to-face contact. A startup I work with last week, we had a hacking of our chief operating officer's account and messages coming from him, his email, to senior people in the organization asking for emergency transfers of money. And the end result is, yeah, we note pretty quickly, but put in place a rule which says that unless you have direct physical confirmation, do not make transfers even on an intercompany basis. And this is something that we're seeing more and more. And this is actually one of our emerging major challenges from the standpoint of international commerce, is that the risks of fraud and crime are reducing some of the benefits of the technological frameworks which we've developed for things like instant cross-border payments. And this is something that is proving to be a greater and greater challenge. And it's something that, if we want to think about, it's not necessarily easy to solve. In other words, amongst the most, as this story highlights, amongst the most rapid uptake of particularly generative AI tools has come from criminals. They're not terribly worried about fairness. 80, 90% accuracy, that's great. And so this is something where I was at a discussion last week about AI at the Financial Conduct Authority, and it was actually about personalization. And what we've seen is, there's the old joke about we were promised flying cars and we were given 40 characters, basically saying that tech gave us Twitter instead of sort of transformation. But when we talk about personalization, when we think about personalization of business and finance, in many cases what we've actually gotten is personalization of finance and financial crime. It's become far easier to make fraudulent systems than it was before, and those systems, and that's what this story is about. It's interesting because we are talking about your instantaneous transaction. This is instantaneous crime. This is, someone hacks your account, takes your money. But increasingly, we're seeing multi-step efforts where complex profiles are built in order to be able to make much larger criminal gains, often from organizations and entities. And so this is something where, if we're thinking about one of those cross-border commercial challenges, which is rapidly evolving, geopolitics, certainly, but cross-border digital fraud and crime is one of our biggest ones. Pick up a couple of more, and then we'll take a break. It's been a crazy week for commodities. Gold prices are dramatically down after a crazy run up. Silver prices, the same. Copper prices, the same. Bitcoin, it's not a commodity, but crazy up and down prices there too. And this is about wheat. And this, I think, is interesting because as we look at wheat and copper, we start to get some interesting examples that highlight the way in which international processes work to support commerce. You pick up two pieces. This is GAFTA. GAFTA is an international trade association with over 1,900 members in 100 countries. Our aim is to promote international trade in agricultural commodities, spices, and general produce, and to protect our members' interest worldwide. Obviously, we highlighted that amongst the oldest forms of commerce are in the context of agricultural products, particularly long life staples, things like wheat and rice. Vegetables are harder because they don't last as long, but things like wheat and rice, these we have very long histories of trade. And this organization, GAFTA, can trace its origins back to 1878, so this is late 19th century globalization of commerce when the London Corn Trade Association, and this is always complicated because in the 19th century, the British called wheat corn. So you'll read about the Corn Laws. They had nothing to do with corn, that was wheat. So Corn Trading Association was actually about wheat trade. Was established by members of the corn trade, wheat trade, to protect their interests. LCTA sought to achieve this, and this starts to highlight some of our typical methods for international commercial law support. Adoption of standard forms of contract drawn up by the association. In other words, if one is trading something that is standard, one wheat is not that different from another, and that wheat transaction is on a cross-border global basis, it's very handy if you have standardized contracts. Now, think about that. Standardized contract is a way to reduce transaction costs. Yeah, maybe it's not as good from the standpoint of the lawyer, because, for instance, if you and I are selling wheat and we need to bring in you to draft a contract, then as a lawyer, you're happy about that. But we can say, actually, we can get a standard contract from these guys, and then we know it works, and we can pay you much less, which reduces the costs of our wheat transaction and increases the predictability that we know the contractual system is going to work. And so, one process we see at the heart of international commercial law is very frequently the drafting of standardized contracts that enable more predictability, lower transaction costs, higher efficiency in those transactions. And there's a second aspect. With any disputes arising out of these contracts being settled via arbitration rather than legislation. Disputes were referred to London and conducted under English law. We will see very frequently that there is a preference for international mechanisms, particularly of arbitration or mediation when we are talking about commerce. There's often a desire, in many cases, to avoid domestic courts, though we do see very frequent use of the courts of certain jurisdictions like England, New York, Singapore, a number of others, which are viewed as predictable and dependable from the standpoint of disputes between parties that have nothing to do with the jurisdiction. But the dispute resolution process is very important from the standpoint of predictability and therefore enhancing the commercial attractiveness, viability of transactions. And if we look at the GAFTA site, we can see GAFTA develops the standard forms of contracts on which it is estimated that 80% of the world's grain is shipped, and is keen to encourage the further use of its contracts within the trade. In other words, in areas where standardized contracts are successful, we often see them used for the majority of transactions. That's something where there's a trust within the industry and therefore an efficiency and a predictability. GAFTA owns the copyright, and while GAFTA contracts can be downloaded by parties wishing to trade, they must not be stored. Now, arbitration. GAFTA's arbitration service provides parties who use our standard forms of contract with a system to resolve trade disputes in a fast and efficient manner. Mediation. Additionally, we offer contracting bodies an alternative to arbitration by using mediation to resolve disputes. Mediation can be used at any time and is a useful way to assist parties in negotiating solutions while at the same time preserving trade relations. And as we'll see in a number of other contexts, they have, in addition to providing for arbitration or mediation as options in their standardized contracts, they also provide a set of rules for those arbitrations so that parties have a level of predictability in how the disputes will be settled, And they also maintain a panel of arbitrators, experts who know the grain industry and are seen by commercial parties in that industry as having the ability to understand the specifics of the industry, but also to be able to come up with fair results. And this, when we look at international commercial processes, we'll see quite a lot of organizations that offer this package. In other words, a group which has common interests, in this case the grain industry, bands together, they come up with standardized contracts to make transactions cheaper and more predictable to support the growth of their business, and they provide a dispute resolution system and service which goes along with that process to address disputes. And we'll see throughout the course quite a wide range of different industries and different organizations which undertake different varieties of this particular combination. I'm going to give one more example, which is related, but if you will, one step beyond what we just saw with GAFTA. This is the London Metals Exchange. And the London Metals Exchange is the largest trading venue for copper. Now, we often take something like copper trading via an exchange as something that we don't necessarily have to think very much about how the processes actually work. But for the system to work, there are a number of aspects embedded into that. The first is, and we will also see this in the grain context, a series of standards. In other words, copper could be mixed with all kinds of other things. How good is the copper you're getting? What level of purity is viewed as acceptable within the industry? What sorts of organizations are there to test copper to make sure that it is of the level of purity? Take, for instance, something that we all know quite well. Think about gold. You've got 24-karat gold, you've got 18-karat gold, you've got 10-karat gold, and a variety of others. Essentially, these are levels of purity. This is a standardized grading system which is applied throughout the industry globally that enables users to understand the quality of what they are getting, and it is backed by a variety of testing systems which will essentially certify that it is within an acceptable range in order to receive that grading. And similarly, copper and many other sorts of things that we see traded in standardized form are done in exactly the same way. Industry standards to give predictability to people who are engaged in buying and selling and enable trust in the products which are being secured. Now, this is an interesting one because often we think about something like copper. It's trading on an exchange. The price of those contracts are set across the exchange. The contract, we call it a contract. It is a contract. It's a standardized contract for a certain amount of copper of a certain level of purity that is deliverable at a certain place at a certain time. It's a contract that is being traded through the exchange. But as a purchaser of the contract, you have the right to take physical delivery of the copper. And if we look at this, we can see three things here. Global reference price, the LME official price is the global benchmark price for copper and used as indexation in primary and secondary copper contracts, as well as in hedging transactions. So primary, these are essentially contracts where people are buying copper, often because they need it for industrial purposes. Secondary, this is basically trading and speculation. Hedging is using purchases to try to protect against price fluctuations. So obviously, for the purpose of this course, we're interested really in that primary transaction and the system that is developed to make it easier to buy and sell one of our most important industrial commodities that is used for almost everything across the world. Unparalleled liquidity and market depth, so this is tradability, enables physical and financial participants to accurately hedge and take a view on supply and demand dynamics. In 2025, over 170,000 lots were traded on average day. Now, this is the part that doesn't necessarily get picked up in sorts of discussions about copper prices, but from the standpoint of users, this is the really important point. Global warehouse network, settlement via physical deliveries across 400 warehouses in 32 global locations. In other words, part of the core business of the exchange is making sure that the physical copper can get to its end users, and that cost is part of the contract. In other words, these locations are standard locations which are viewed as, for purposes, not necessarily additional from a cost standpoint. These are pre-approved warehouses which often, think about how Amazon works. Amazon has warehouses where they use predictive analytics on the basis of past purchase patterns to store volumes of stuff which people buy. That's kind of the Amazon business model. These warehouses do the same thing. In other words, if you decide to take delivery on a contract for copper, the copper is already in the warehouse. It's not being shipped to that warehouse because you've just selected. The copper is pre-positioned in these warehouses to meet predicted demand of the global copper customer base, which is highly industrial. So this is one where, once again, if we're thinking about commercial law, this is a private sector process. It's a company which was originally established as a membership organization between a group of copper traders and users, standardization of terms for the metal, standardization of contracts, and standardization of delivery to make it as easy as possible for customers across the world to get market prices in the substance and to get the substance at an acceptable level of quality where they need it for whatever processes they are doing. All right, let's take about a 10-minute break, pick up at 7:20. And I have no idea whether there's any coffee machine, vending machine, cafe, not the slightest idea. So let me know what you find.
code for the attendance?
Yeah. I'll put it back up.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yep. There we go.
My enrollment has not completed
Yeah, no problem.
yet, so I haven't seen my attendance.
Okay.
So could you please note that?
Yeah, send me an email.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you.
I
Yeah.
have a problem. Last week I was in class, but we didn't have it in our schedule somehow.
Strange.
So yeah. So
Send me an email and I
didn't
can
have-
add it.
Yeah, I didn't have my attendance record last week.
Yeah, so send me an email and I should be able to add it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have some issues with the app. I cannot attend.
Send me an email and I'll try to do it. Yeah, you're welcome.
I know the email. It's on.
It's on the first slide as well. Yeah. Yeah. Hey. Hey. Yeah.
I want to ask you, actually I'm auditing, I'm auditing.
Yeah.
I came here to see if I should change my the other courses that I've taken, because I'm doing shipping law,
Yeah.
and I think this is very relevant to what I've been doing, and it's very useful for me because it combines everything
in one place, yeah.
and you're very, very good.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Very good, and I think I understand better. And I was just wondering your opinion about it, because we've been doing carriage of goods, we've been doing insurance. Do you think it's very overlapping? And
It's not really overlapping because we only have one class on sort of carriage, whereas you'll have an entire course on. And our
Yeah.
carriage will cover not just sea,
yeah.
but we'll also cover air and
Aviation.
yeah.
also taking aviation.
Okay, cool. So
okay,
yeah, but yeah, no, we'll only have one class on that, and yeah, no, I would say the overlap won't be big.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm gonna change it.
Ah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Righty. That's good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
The door was locked. That's why we couldn't enter.
No worries.
We waited for someone to open the door.
That's
Yeah,
really
They
yeah.
locked it. Our cars didn't work.
That's really strange.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry about the problem with it.
Thank you.
Yeah. You guys were just locked out?
Yeah, they were locked
All right. Very funny. That's strange. Yeah, I'm gonna try mine real quick. I think mine is working. So, yeah. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right. All right. That's good. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'll check with the administration to see if there's anything we can do about your IDs not opening the doors, which is less than ideal. Mine did seem to work. I just tested it, so that's good at least. All right. No idea. Good. All right, as everybody wanders back in, let me start. Any questions or comments? All right, then. As we think about international commerce and international commercial law throughout this course, we're going to see essentially two different approaches. In some cases, and the majority of cases we'll be looking at when we're talking about states, we'll be talking about harmonization. In other words, mechanisms to try to bring laws in different places in line with one another. But as we're going to see, that idea of bringing different laws and legal systems together is an inherently difficult process. And if anything, that process in today's increasingly geopolitically fractious world is going to get more complicated rather than less. But we also do see a range of efforts whereby there may be a single set of rules applied in a certain context. And if we want to take the GAFTA example or the COFPR example, these are examples where an industry is determining to put a single set of rules in place. They're not necessarily harmonizing systems in different places. Rather, they're trying to build a system which operates in many cases outside of the domestic rules, the domestic legal system of the individual jurisdictions concerned. And this kind of takes us back. This is a number of different definitions to that question that we raised last week. One way to think about commercial law, the totality of the law's response to mercantile disputes, encompassing all those principles, rules, statutory provisions of whatever kind and from whatever source, which bear on the private law rights and obligations of parties to commercial transactions. This is a very broad definition and broader than what we're going to be using. Transnational commercial law, that set of private law principles and rules from whatever source which governs international commercial transactions and is common to legal systems generally or to a significant number of legal systems. And this, if you will, is a pretty formal legal definition, and a fair amount of what we're going to be looking at will fall in this context. But as we just saw with the GAFTA and LME examples, these are something that is not necessarily what we might think of as traditional state-based law, but rather what we might think of as lex mercatoria. All sources of transnational commercial law, including public international law, uniform laws, general principles of law, rules of international organizations, customs and usages, standard form contracts, and reporting of arbitral awards. Or, a bit more narrowly and perhaps a bit easier, that part of transnational commercial law which consists of the unwritten customs and usages of merchants so far as these satisfy certain externally set criteria for validation. As you're going to see, I'm tending towards our sort of broad definition of lex mercatoria for the simple reason that when one is thinking about international commerce, there's a wide variety of different standards and approaches which matter. We're less interested in this course about the processes, though the processes are important, and more interested in the actual impact on commercial transactions. In other words, their usefulness. And something that we're definitely going to see as we turn to our range of different sources is some of our processes are far more successful than others. We're going to see, and certainly if you look in the two books, there's a discussion of the more successful ones, but both Good as well as Twigg-Fleiser, they both will also highlight the range of less successful examples. And it's often interesting to see which are successful to try to figure out why some of those have been more successful than others and what implications this may have as we think about trying to address issues going forward. So, legal sources for transnational commercial law, contract, obviously, this is going to be key. But in many cases, we're going to be looking at various forms of standardized contracts. So much more so than individual bespoke contracts, much more from the standpoint of standardization. Lex mercatoria, and in particular, these are things like the ways that industries organize themselves. Think about the grain industry example, organizing itself around rules that make sense from the standpoint of the industry. International and regional instruments, and we'll see a variety of different forms of formal international treaties across the course. Judicial and legislative parallelism, and the parallelism is often very important when we think about harmonization processes. And in addition to formal treaty-based approaches, we see a wide range of things that we might call soft law standards. Things like model laws or principles or guidance, which jurisdictions then implement into their own domestic legal systems. Domestic law and regulation, both as these impact transactions, but also, as I mentioned, because we do have a relatively small number of jurisdictions whose legal systems are frequently used for disputes and for structuring transactions between parties who have no connection to that legal system. And that's something that, if we're thinking about options in structuring a relationship or an agreement, that is a very valid structure. Contractually incorporated rules and trade terms promulgated by international organizations. We'll see a variety of examples of these where there are essentially definitions or terms which are set at an international level and which are often incorporated directly into contracts. Things like Incoterms or a variety of ICC rules and standards which are incorporated specifically into contracts. We've already seen this idea, and the academic term is private ordering. Private ordering is private participants grouping together to organize transaction structures. GAFTA is a prime example. Another one that, for those of you who are studying financial transactions will see is ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. This is an organization of market participants which sets rules for those market participants. They do this out of self-interest. For whatever reason, their belief is that those rules, contracts, dispute resolution systems, these will reduce transaction costs, enhance predictability, and support more business for the members. Restatements and opinions, occasionally general principles of international law, and something that we will see is the question about the role of technology, both directly, in some cases, can technology provide the same function, and in other cases where technology works with a variety of other sorts of legal tools. And you'll frequently see, particularly in the literature, many commercial law academics are fascinated with this idea that there could be some form of autonomous transnational commercial law, a sort of law of merchants, that merchants build their own legal system to deal with the sorts of problems and disputes which they have. And there are certain examples which are not that far off of this, and that's kind of fascinating to see. In most cases, the reality is what we often talk about, that systems operate in the shadow of the law, that there is some sort of formal legal system, state-based backup that is there if the private ordering system doesn't work. But we will see some cases where this does appear to be the case. And certainly, some have certainly argued that blockchain could be a mechanism which would essentially be autonomous from the standpoint of transactional operation without a role for states. We'll highlight why this may or may not be the case. Harmonization. Obviously, one can think about the role of globalization. I've sort of highlighted that we have these cycles across human history where we have cross-border economic activity. And when we have those periods, there is typically a drive for various mechanisms to try to address these common sorts of problems. In other words, anytime one is looking at cross-border transactions, and the more cross-border transactions you have, the more need there are for mechanisms which allow greater time, distance, and risk management, reduction of transaction costs, and increasing of predictability. So it's not necessarily the case that harmonization is purely a result of our most recent period of globalization. There's also an argument, and you'll certainly see some arguments, that globalization and the role of commercial law are inexplicably entwined, particularly with colonial processes and Marxist dominance patterns. This is, I think, an open question. And I think we're in one of those periods where some of those trading patterns are changing, and we'll have an opportunity to test this thesis in a sort of different context. I think there's a strong argument that one could say 19th century imperial processes led to many of these commercial processes, but there's certainly an argument that as those trading patterns change today, that we may see the same sorts of functional problems driving processes of the same sorts, but with different dominant actors than we've seen in the past. We may not. It's an open question, but I think that that's an interesting one that one can watch to see the test of whether or not it is or is not. Now, let's talk about a few agencies and processes, and the ones that in the literature, and actually in this course, that are going to come up the most frequently are the Hague Conference on Private International Law, the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, UNIDROIT, and the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, or UNCITRAL. And it's interesting that if we look at each of these three, the time in which they were formed is quite different. So if we look at the Hague Conference on Private International Law, Hague Conference actually dates (1893). So this is pre-League of Nations, pre-UN. And it's particularly interesting because I tend to characterize the period we're in today as one where we have an increasing return to a system which was last present in the 19th century, where you have major power, multipolar, mercantilistic competition. And it's interesting that if we look at the Hague Conference and its efforts to unify or harmonize private international law, it's very much a period of similar multipolar, mercantilistic competition between major powers, some of which are the same today, others of which are not. So that's an interesting starting point. If we look at UNIDROIT, UNIDROIT is part of the League of Nations. So if we actually think about this, in the context of the League of Nations process at the end of the First World War, one sees one area where they felt there was a need for international cooperation was in the area of private law. And so you get both the Hague Conference and UNIDROIT. These are treaty-based organizations, but both of them predate the post-Second World War UN framework. UNCITRAL, as its name would suggest, established as part of the UN system. United Nations Commission on International Trade Law is the core legal body of the United Nations system in the field of international trade law, but this is private international trade law, not public. So public trade law is basically the WTO. UNCITRAL is basically private trade law. A legal body with universal membership specializing in commercial law reform worldwide for over 50 years. UNCITRAL's business is the modernization and harmonization of rules on international business. And if we look at these three organizations, they definitely overlap. There's no question. And something that's kind of funny to watch with them in practice is they definitely compete with one another as well. There's definitely an element of competition between the three organizations. But often they are doing similar things through similar processes. All three are engaged in the development of treaty-based systems, but we also see all three engaged in processes of various forms of soft law. Now, if we look at their coverage, the coverage of all three is a little bit different, and each of them is a bit broader than what we're looking at in the context of this course. There is, in the context of any international organization, but certainly these three, there's a bit of an entrepreneurial process. In other words, they're always looking for something to do. And the members, and often the participants, and they all three have working groups. Those working groups tend to be a mix of government lawyers and legal academics. And these working groups are always looking for new issues. Sometimes the new issues they come up with are issues that are driven from problems of real international commercial practice. Other times, they're just ones that are of interest to the lawyers involved. And there's probably a direct relationship between the success of different processes and the relevance of those processes to actual commercial problems, rather than things which are just interesting legal issues. So, if we want to look at Hague Conference, Hague Conference says it focuses on three main areas: international family and child protection law, transnational litigation and apostille, and international commercial, digital, and financial law. So it's private law broadly. So private law broadly includes family law, a full range of disputes, but part of the dispute process are things like service of process and a wide range of commercial law beyond just our narrow definition of commerce, but also expanding into a range of digital issues and also financial issues. Each of these has handily on their website all of their various instruments and also all of their various projects. I'll take a look at Hague Conference and UNCITRAL because their websites are particularly easy to see. So this is full list of conventions. So since its inception, over 40 conventions and instruments have been adopted under the auspices of the Hague Conference. Of these, a selected number known as the core conventions and instruments are prioritized based on their recent adoption, popularity, or practical relevance. And so you have wills, apostille, service, divorce, evidence, child abduction, arranged here. And then you also have quite a large number of others, and you have a range of older conventions dating back to its original level. Now, something that we will prioritize in here is those that tend to be adopted or implemented more widely. And so this chart has on this axis members of the Hague Conference, and across the top you have the signatories, ratifications, approvals, and accession. And this is thus a pretty handy way to see what has been widely adopted and what hasn't. And if you look at this, we can kind of see, okay, Civil Procedure Convention, lots of yeses. We can see the 1955 Sales of Goods Convention, not very many yeses. We can see the 1958 Transfer of Title Convention. Do we have any yeses on that one? We have 2 out of a membership of 91. Clearly not one of their more successful efforts. We want to pick out successful. 1961 Apostille Convention, 1965 Service Convention. Basically conventions on procedural delivery issues. Evidence, 1970 Evidence Commission. And something that is good to see, but not really in our area. 1980 Child Abduction Convention, very widely. 1993 Adoption Convention. 1996 Child Protection Convention. And if we come over here, Child Support Convention, we can say that amongst its most successful areas have been in private law aspects of child-related issues and issues around evidentiary aspects of dispute resolution. But we see it engaging in a wide range of other projects. So if we look at its areas, projects, certain areas where it's working right now, carbon markets, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, digital economy, digital tokens, intellectual property, jurisdiction, parentage and surrogacy, restructuring, and insolvency. So it's engaged, if we look at these, carbon markets, CBDCs, digital tokens, it's focusing more on the financial side. And whether or not it ends up being more successful with some of these efforts is open to question. But we'll see that there is some overlap with some of the others. So we'll look at a number of the Hague Conference projects. But if you'll note, some of their commercial ones have not been amongst their most successful ones over time. Now, UNIDROIT doesn't have, if you will, a chart that is quite as easy to read. And this is one where instead we'll be looking at things individually. But if we look at UNIDROIT's coverage, these are existing instruments. So agency, and this takes us when we talk about structures, agency, distribution, franchising, different mechanisms that you see for distribution globally. Agriculture. This is an area particularly around certain aspects of agricultural receipts where they're doing some interesting work, and we'll come back to. Capital markets, civil procedure, commercial contracts, cultural property, digital assets and private law, factoring, franchising, insolvency, international sales, international will, leasing, warehouse receipts, reinsurance, security interests, and transport. So one can say a fair amount of overlap with the Hague Conference, but with some differences. And in particular, we see UNIDROIT fairly heavily engaged on aspects of trade financing, things like leasing, factoring, mechanisms to make it easier to use goods and other things from the standpoint of financing themselves for trade purposes. And UNCITRAL. So this is a similar status table for UNCITRAL conventions as we saw with the Hague Conference. But UNCITRAL in particular is very active with doing soft law projects, model laws, which are not treaty-based instruments, but are processes where you have members agree on principles, structures, etc., that would then have to be implemented into domestic legal systems. And once again, it's not universal. Some of these model law projects have been highly successful and influential, and we'll look at some of those. But many of them haven't been very widely adopted. So it's a very mixed bag in the context of both the soft law projects, the ones which are model laws and similar sorts of things, as well as the hard law treaty conventions. And if we look at these, the one that pops up by far the most frequently, and of course, if we're looking at UNCITRAL, this is particularly interesting because since this is a UN organization, membership is almost universal. And this is quite different to the Hague Conference and UNIDROIT, which have wide membership, but by no means universal. So in the context of certain of these conventions, you can see that very widely adopted. So New York Convention on Arbitration is by far their most widely adopted. And this, of course, from the standpoint of dispute resolution, is tremendously important because it allows a wide range of parties across a wide range of jurisdictions to be able to use arbitration in the context of different systems. If we look at contracts for the international sale of goods from 1980, this is one that we'll spend a fair amount of time on and has been quite widely adopted and implemented. Some of their rules on carriage of goods by sea, Hamburg, Rotterdam rules, relatively widely adopted. And if we look at one of their more recent, Singapore Convention on Mediation and Beijing Convention on the Judicial Sale of Ships from 2022, is, given that it's only been out for 4 years, the numbers of ratifications are pretty significant. So we can see a number of areas of success from the standpoint of formal conventions, particularly around arbitration, mediation, and dispute resolution, but also around certain aspects of shipping and, importantly, around sale of goods. These are conventions, and where's the model laws? And this is just model laws. And if we look at these, UNCITRAL model law on international commercial arbitration is quite widely implemented. UNCITRAL model law on procurement of goods, construction, and services, model law on electronic commerce is one that we see quite widely. Insolvency, so we see a number of areas where some of the model laws have been quite widely adopted and implemented. Electronic commerce, commercial arbitration, electronic signatures, commercial conciliation, a range of these where we've seen a fairly high number of successes. But once again, we have a number where very few, UNCITRAL model law on secured transactions, for instance, one that's very frequently referred to if we look at the actual sorts of implementation numbers on UNCITRAL's own database, not very significant. And so, when we're looking at these different areas, we will tend to be looking at Hague Conference, UNIDROIT, UNCITRAL, and we will be tending to focus on those instruments, whether hard law like conventions or soft law like model laws and principles, which have been most widely adopted and used by parties in international commerce and transactions. But not just those. And the other ones that we'll definitely be spending a fair amount of time on, particularly this one. This is the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC. And this is different than the Hague Conference, UNIDROIT, or UNCITRAL. Each of these, Hague Conference, UNIDROIT, UNCITRAL, these are traditional public law international organizations with states as members. ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, basically its members are chambers of commerce and businesses operating internationally. And in many ways, it does a similar sort of process that we saw with GAFTA. In other words, it has developed a series of standardized contracts which are available for use by its members in a range of different areas. And it also provides a dispute resolution system, both from the standpoint of rules for arbitration and mediation, but also from the standpoint of actually providing lists and also facilities for the conduct of arbitration and mediation. In terms of business solutions, we find ATA Carne. Essentially what this is an effort to put together a document in an electronic form which is a single trade document. In other words, something that is able to go through customs and shipping processes across a wide range of jurisdictions to make it easier to ship things around the world, increase predictability, and reduce costs. We have the Incoterms, which is a standardized set of contractual terms that are core to international sales and shipping, and which are very widely used in international commercial businesses. It has a set of model contracts and model clauses for a wide range of things: sales, agency, distributorship, contracts for startups, occasional intermediaries. And these contracts are all available to members, but also for purchase via the website, and therefore easily tailored to transactions. We also see that the ICC is the primary source for terms around one of our primary payment and financing mechanisms, which are letters of credit. And they have built standardized terms which are used in the vast majority of letters of credit for cross-border payments. And one that we will be looking at is they also, and we see this with GAFTA and the other industry associations, they also engage in lobbying processes. In other words, processes whereby they try to identify problems amongst their membership, they try to develop solutions and systems which their membership will actually use, and they lobby governments and international organizations to change rules to make it easier to do cross-border commerce. And one that we'll be picking up on in particular is around digital economy. And this is one that I actually gave you one of the documents, and you'll see a variety of documents. This is the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. And this is interesting because it combines a series of organizations. The ICC, supported by the WTO, the Asian Development Bank, the World Customs Organization, and essentially what it is trying to do is identify the barriers to digitizing cross-border commercial transactions. And it's an interesting one that, as we're going to see, despite the kind of digitization of everything, until very recently, a number of processes, particularly in international trade, have remained remarkably paper-based, particularly things around letters of credit, which are very frequently paper-based, and also things around various forms of bills of lading, which also tend to be very heavily paper-based. And there are reasons why both letters of credit and bills of lading tend to still be paper-based, but there are a range of efforts, including via this organization, to try to figure out ways to address those issues to reduce the use of paper, to reduce the costs in transaction. And this one is 6.5 billion in documentation costs could be saved if bills of lading are used instead of physical bills of lading. At the moment, 12.8% of bills of lading are electronic as opposed to paper-based, which if you think about that, that's kind of striking, that in today's world, that less than 15% of bills of lading are digitally based rather than paper-based. And if you look at 2024 figure, it was only 5%. So they're actually making some substantial progress, but the dominance of non-digital forms and certain aspects of international trade and commerce is very heavy. Now, you all have now been at Queen Mary long enough to realize that Queen Mary is a sort of paperless-based place. And certainly my conclusion, having been involved in paperless approaches to everything, is sometimes paper is okay. And so I'm not someone who necessarily says that we need to get rid of all of the paper in international commerce. But there is an agreement that there is a fair amount of inefficiency as a result of the dominance of paper-based transactions, and that there are opportunities for certain efficiencies which could be gained as a result of certain levels of digitization. And I want to pick up. This was the key trade documents and data elements from the ICC digital standards. And this report is quite interesting because it does an analysis across trade of areas where there are opportunities for digitalization. And where I'm going to go is this. So this is interesting. They have categorized various forms of documents where the document has been standardized. So I've talked about this process where much of international commercial law has been about developing standardized documents, which in some cases become very widely used. And it's interesting to see the volume of standardization, but they've also highlighted areas where some standards exist, but low levels of interoperability, and some areas where standardization is still at a very early stage. And if we look at the standardization list, commercial invoices, bills of lading, sea waybills, ships delivery orders, air waybills, sea and air cargo manifests, rail consignment notes, down here, bills of exchange, promissory notes, a wide range of different areas. And essentially, the idea is that where something has been standardized, that should provide an opportunity for digitization. And areas where things have not yet been standardized provides an area for increasing attention. And so you'll get, I think this document is interesting because it provides, if you will, a detailed analysis of the trade transaction, the pieces where standardization has occurred, and the areas where digitalization provides opportunities. And we'll come back to various pieces of this. Our other organization that I mentioned last time is one that we will mention in passing Because it is, I think, one that we're seeing more and more. And it's one where we're actually seeing some efforts around competition across different countries for standard setting processes. In other words, as we saw with copper or grain, standardization of essentially quality is very central to easing transactions. It heightens trust, increases efficiency, increases predictability. So we have lots of areas where it's useful to have standards which can then be referred to by users or purchasers as a means of saying, all right, I'm buying this, it meets certain standards, so I know what I'm getting, without necessarily having to spend a huge amount of time and effort in the context of investigation. And the International Standards Organization is an organization where we are seeing more and more expansion of the areas and sectors where it is creating standards, because participants are finding the availability of standards useful. So, if we want to think about this idea of processes of international commercial law, there are a wide range of different organizations. And every week, I'll probably come up with some new random organization like GAFTA or the London Metals Exchange that is doing something in some specific area. But generally, the processes are the same. Mechanisms to try to standardize contracts, to sort out dispute resolution, to standardize terms and conditions, and in many cases where possible, to smooth and harmonize legal processes. Hard law, soft law, trade usage, contractually incorporated rules. This is kind of the range that we're going to see. And in many cases, you'll see an organization like UNCITRAL or the Hague Conference uses the full range. In other words, just because it's an international law organization, not everything they do will be hard law treaty based. Very frequently, there is a range of usage of soft law, model laws, principle-based systems, codification processes, and we also see a wide range of particularly industry-specific trade usages and standard contracts. We've looked at these certain aspects, arguably, UNIDROIT principles of international commercial contracts, UN Convention on International Sales Contracts. These are often seen as particularly successful examples, and we'll be spending some time next week focusing on both of these, but also from the standpoint of Incoterms, because at the end of the day, it's the sale of goods contract that is the basis of our commercial transaction. The other pieces tend to be added on. Now, what I want to flag, or where I want to go at this point, is to pick up a couple of more of these before we wrap up. The first is because we picked up GAFTA and the LME, we have to pick out this one. What is this one? This is essentially the gold trading organization. This is the London Base Metals Authority, and essentially it does market standards. So this is London precious metals markets, market standards. And if we look at market standards, standards consist of three parts: good delivery, which is about the quality of the gold. Only gold and silver bars that meet good delivery standards are acceptable in the settlement of a London contract where the bullion is traded physically. Now, this is important. And this is a little bit bizarre, and we'll see this a couple of times throughout the course. Your major gold markets don't have the same transaction sizes. In other words, London markets is a 400 troy ounce bar of a certain purity, and for silver, 1,000 troy ounces. New York has very different size quantities. One thing that if you want to actually ship physical gold to trade from London to New York is you actually have to melt it down and rebar it to meet the New York standards, which, and this is something that we will see sometime during the semester, there are a small number of firms that are actually certified as sufficiently quality to refine gold from one market to another. One of those firms is based in Switzerland. So typically when you will have these periods where maybe there's a price difference between gold in London and New York, and people want to ship physical gold from London to New York or New York to London, it actually has to go via Switzerland to get melted down and rebarred to meet the requirements of the other market. Hong Kong is in the process of building a similar sort of gold market, and you might think that maybe Hong Kong would match the New York or London sizes and weights. No, a third set. So actually, if you want to ship gold from Hong Kong to London to New York, you are going to have it rebarred between each transaction. So LBMA sets the standards for transactions. Historically, and it's interesting, if you think about gold, a fair amount of gold is, people want to just hold it as an asset. And something that we will look at throughout the semester are a number of ways that gold is actually used in this way. So if we actually want to think about the largest portion of the world's gold is actually held by personal customers in South Asia and China. That's your largest single portion. Next largest portion is actually held in New York. Next after that is actually held in London. Why? Because most gold transactions, the gold doesn't actually go anywhere. If you look at Bank Station, the Bank of England sits there, and somewhere underneath the train are the Bank of England gold vaults. And most of our gold transactions in London, when it is sold from one government or one party to another, the gold doesn't leave. It sits there and is simply reallocated in the context of a ledger. In some cases, a physical printout of the name may be moved from one pile to another. Today, we are, as a result of geopolitical issues, we are seeing some movement away from these standardized, centralized systems. I mentioned the competing market in Hong Kong. We are now also seeing increasing efforts by governments, beginning with Russia, but now quite a lot of other governments, to move gold back to their home jurisdiction. And this is probably a trend that we're seeing, and that actually makes it less liquid from the standpoint of an asset. So one side is around the standards. This enables you to know what level of gold you're actually getting. The second set is around standards of best practice. So this is to enable dealers to essentially trust one another from the standpoint of behavior. Code is intended to define a robust, fair, effective, and transparent market where all participants are able to transact following best practice guidelines. Sets out a common set of principles to promote the integrity and effective functioning of the global market, covering ethics, governance, compliance, risk management, information sharing, and business conduct. And finally, responsible sourcing, and this is something that is focused on a due diligence framework around the sourcing of the gold that is actually traded in the market. And so you see a process of creating standards, behavioral standards, quality and purity standards, and actually sustainability ethical standards that go to underpinning the market, so that whether or not you are buying as a financial investment or you are buying physical gold to actually use in jewelry or industrial projects, you have a certain level of assurance about what it is that you're buying and the standards of behavior expected within that industry. And this is, I want to finalize with one last news story. Fraud. Two. I actually want two. This one is interesting from the standpoint of when I talked about the grain market. And what is interesting here is the fact that there are certain factors which are changing the commercial dynamics of that market in new and potentially unpleasant ways. The first of these is that productivity for major cereals, and this is basically wheat, rice, barley, is decreasing. Much of our gains in food production over the past 50 years have come from productivity increases, and if those productivity increases go to low levels, but population increases outpace the productivity increases in food production, this is potentially quite negative from the standpoint of substantial portions of the world's population. So that's piece one. Piece two is that most of the food exports actually come from a small number of countries. So this is interesting as we think about those commercial dynamics, because what it means is if we're looking at the production side, the producers are unlikely to change significantly. The consumers, of course, are much more global. And so in some ways, this makes it easier for a relatively small number of producers to work together to standardize transaction systems, which then apply to the rest. And if we look at these, US, Ukraine, Brazil, Indonesia, Argentina, Canada, Russia, Malaysia, France, Australia, and that's pretty much it from the standpoint of corn, wheat, rice. These are your major exporters. And so from the standpoint of the market, it's interesting that it has become highly concentrated from the standpoint of production, and also that we're seeing decreases in the increase of productivity of crops. And our third piece is really around climate change and the potential impact from the standpoint of this relatively small number of surplus producers, which is uncertain at this stage. But it does mean that from the standpoint of much of the world, there is a high level of vulnerability both to geopolitical issues amongst this group, but also to climate change issues amongst this group. But from the standpoint of commercial processes, the fact that you have a relatively small group would generally make it easier. But of course, you have some lack of cohesion, but at the same time, really with the exception of Russia, it is a remarkably cohesive group on the supply side, which is interesting, I think, from the production dynamics. Last story for the day. Supply chains. When obviously over is it going to, yes, all right. Over the past 5 years or so, we've had, between the combination of COVID and increasing geopolitical issues, we're seeing a wide range of impacts on supply chain structure. In other words, if we wanted to look pre-COVID, the tendency was to have the emergence of concentrated supply chains. Think about semiconductors. Semiconductors are a highly concentrated supply chain. You've had, over a period of decades, one producer which has emerged as far more efficient and competitive than the others. And if one is thinking about a purely market-driven or efficiency-driven paradigm, having one highly specialized producer that produces very efficiently, high quality, predictably, that's a good thing. But over the past 6 to 8 years, we've had two changes come in, and that is one around security issues, but two issues around the view that there are potentially negative aspects to producing or outsourcing all forms of manufacturing. And as a result, countries around the world are trying to develop alternative production sources, but we have also had companies diversifying supply chains. Generally, the view is that for any important piece of a process, that you should have at least 2 different potential suppliers in different markets. That means that if a natural disaster or something closes one, you have another. So generally, the direction we're seeing in supply chains is away from highly concentrated supply chains and towards supply chains where at least you have two parallel suppliers for each individual piece. And this survey highlights exactly this in the context of European firms and their Chinese-dominated supply chains. Over 70% of European firms in China review supply chain strategies. The findings show how European firms must maintain a delicate balancing act between China's tight security and focus on self-reliance. 7 out of every 10 European companies operating in China were reviewing their supply chain strategies amid geopolitical tensions and Beijing's opaque policy making, which appears to set back the country's globalization efforts. We are not seeing countries leave China, but we are seeing companies shift their supply chain strategies and change their management structures. And this is the key bit. A growing number of European businesses were setting up two supply chain systems, one for China and the other for the rest of the world, to bypass regulatory requirements on data and information technology systems. So one can actually think about this from two different directions. One is the idea that as a result of issues around security, sustainability, et cetera, firms have put in place supply chains which have multiple suppliers, ideally at least two for any core component coming from different places. That's one. The second is that we are also seeing an increasing number of firms, as a result of geopolitical pressures, develop separate supply chains for different markets. We can see in this context the argument of building a supply chain just for the Chinese market. The big trend since the election of the Trump administration in the United States has been for firms to increasingly build supply chains just for the US market to avoid the targeted tariff structures. There's also a view that Europe, because of its very specific regulatory requirements, an increasing number of firms are building separate supply chains to address the European market. And this is a very different direction from what we might have seen 10 years ago, where the direction was very much to have a single source supply chain organized on a global basis for delivery at different places, but produced through the same chain. Increasingly, security and politics are meaning that firms are having both to build multiple suppliers into their own chains, but also multiple chains to deliver into different markets. And that means that this process of international commercial rule setting, it means that we could end up with some level of competition between different large markets in terms of processes and standards. We're not there yet. We're probably still at a process where the trend is towards, on the legal side, global harmonization. But there certainly is the risk that we could have our three large economies, US, EU, China, increasingly setting their own processes for people to access their market in terms of dispute resolution, standard contracts and terms, technological systems, etc. And that, I think, is another one of our open questions. What I've actually put up here is something that we'll probably come back to at the end of the course when we're looking at dispute resolution. And this is an organization, an international organization called the International Organization for Mediation, which was established last year and based in Hong Kong. Membership, I believe, is up to 19 countries. And this is a new organization focusing on dispute resolution, but established really from a different group of countries. And so if one is thinking about the potential for competing systems, this is a potential example where one, in the context of dispute resolution, we are now seeing the evolution of different organizations with different processes, which may apply in the context of transactions between different markets. All right. We only took one break tonight, so we can finish up a little bit early. Basically, what I wanted to cover tonight was to look at this idea of sources of commercial law and to pick up the main sorts of organizations that we see and broadly the different sorts of processes that we're seeing implemented internationally, as well as some of the bigger trends. Questions or comments on it? All right, well then we'll wrap up for this evening, and I'll see you all here next week. Good. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to ask you something. When I was looking into these to read this, when you look at the ebook of international law, I found two versions. I remember you told us that, if I remember correctly, you told us that this version is kind of the same, but like a little bit on history.
Well, it's just that it's older.
It's older, so
Yeah.
it's just because I found it cheaper. So
Yeah. So, and as I said,
Is
they're
it
perfectly
okay?
interchangeable.
Sorry.
They're perfectly interchangeable. So, but so this the older.
Okay.
That's the older edition of this one.
This one.
Yeah, I wouldn't. That's probably too old. I would stick with the newer version.
Okay.
But the Twig-Flesser book is usually cheaper
Yeah.
than the good book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have
But that's why it's cheap. Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
This is why I wanted to ask because I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah,
When we were talking, when you showed us the ICC.
Yeah.
And the terms.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask what exactly is the difference between bill of lading and sea waiver.
Ah.
Because I'm actually unable to differentiate between them.
Okay. There's actually, the Seaway bill is something that is a little bit less legally significant than a bill of lading. We'll look at, I'll use that to pick up, when we look at the Incoterms next week, I'll pick up those. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. It didn't work, or oh, you need, here, it's this one. I just closed it. Here, it is. SNRBBT. RB. There you go. Yeah. Hey.
I told you I submitted.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I still didn't get the guys to Q&A. So if I didn't by next week's lesson, do I attend or not?
You're always welcome to attend.
But I
So-
want this module like as to be as a credit instead
Yeah,
of the other.
I would chase them tomorrow. But often Mondays, they don't respond very fast.
Who do I like go and contact? If Q plus ask you not respond.
Actually, send me an email because there was someone, Yeah, it's on the front page. It's on the front page of the slides.
Yeah,
But you can't get the slides. Oh, you've got them.
Yeah,
Okay.
my friends.
All right. So it's on the front page of the slides, and send me an email because there was actually someone who answered a query from someone earlier today, and I can give you their email.
Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hey.
I have a question. You know it's the ICC something code, the one with the blue
Yeah.
paper. Is it useful to have that like hard copy or
I
because I mean if it's something we're going to be looking at almost every lecture?
No, we'll look at we'll look at the initiative every lecture, but not that particular report. We'll look at something different from them almost every week. Yeah. You're welcome. Hey.
Hi, how are you? I'm unable to log into.
Okay, so send me an email and I will sign you.
All right, thank you
Yeah.
so much. Have a lovely
Yeah. Hey.
So we could not mark our attendance for the first class.
Okay. Send me an email and I'll try to add it.
Can we get your mail ID?
It's the one on the first slide. It's on the first page of the slides.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hey.
I wanted to make sure the sources, the international commercial law that you mentioned that were also in the book, were referring to the organizations, right?
Yeah, so really we've referred tonight mainly to the organizations and the different approaches. As we move into the specific areas, we'll look at specific instruments and processes and initiatives.
That are made by those organizations.
Yeah.
Okay, and something else. When you mentioned something about gold and that they are first because I will forget the ATA card from the ICC.
Yeah,
I think it's from the ICC. It was.
it is. It's
Yeah. So it was made, or is made, or is in. I don't know if it was already made or not.
It is, yeah.
Well,
And
it
it
will-
is in small levels of use.
it will replace the BOL and the letters. Like,
not
is that
necessarily.
intention?
It's
What's
the bill of
difference?
lading is more difficult, and we'll look
Yeah.
at that later. The carnet is mainly about the various forms of documentation for shipping and customs. So it would include information on the bill
Like
of lading.
freight and-
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But it wouldn't. It's not like the key to a bill of lading is it is a legally impactful. Yeah, and so that's something that it doesn't do. It's
Okay.
an information document.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's the auxiliary documentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there is a process and a new convention that is about the e-bills of lading. But as
That
we'll
was
see,
interesting.
it's really hard.
Okay, then about the gold now. Because you mentioned that not all the countries have the same size, nor the same quality, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly.
Weight.
Yeah.
And they are trying to find the source or the country from which that gold came from.
No. So
How that will happen if they are trading them and they are changing it?
yeah, so essentially, so let's say part of the process in the standards is, it will have an assurance that the gold came from a sort of approved production process.
I would be like
And so-
birth certificate or
Exactly,
something like that.
exactly.
Okay.
But unlike diamonds, and diamonds increasingly have a certificate that this diamond came from this place. Gold, you don't do that because you melt the stuff all together. But what you do need is you need a processor that will collect the documentation for the gold that is coming in, and that you then know that the gold coming out of the processor is all meeting those standards. And as I said, you have this company in Switzerland that does most of this because they are the one they have the assurances.
But the gold will still be from, for example, I don't know, Germany, I don't know, will still be from Germany even if it was processed in that company?
So the key, and this is the thing, is because a block, a blob of gold from one country looks exactly the same as a blob of gold
Yeah.
from another. So what you have to do is a process whereby you certify that the two blobs are coming from acceptable countries. And then when you put them together, you know that they are coming from acceptable sources. You don't know exactly which source. With a
Okay.
diamond, you would.
Because basically they will only care about the quality of
But
the
also the origin. So they care about the origin.
Really?
Yeah,
Why?
yeah, yeah. The origin is hugely important. There are lots of rules around conflict sourcing, and a substantial for gold traded in your major markets like London, New York, Hong Kong. The sourcing is very important.
Okay.
But you do also have a lot of trading that now goes on outside of those places. And we do know, for instance, that the term is artisanal gold, and what that basically means is a guy with a shovel somewhere digging it up. And the standards are not necessarily, but that gold typically wouldn't make it into the London, New York, or Hong Kong markets. It would be sold, in markets
Somewhere
or
else.
exchanges, exactly.
Let's
Russia.
hear.
Yeah.
And something, one more thing. So, the book, the chapters, we talked about harmonization, and I was wondering because I'm not sure. We read that, but here in the class we talked about it, but not deep. I don't know.
Yeah, not as deep,
No,
exactly.
yeah, it was kind of like at the beginning. It was like more of a sources, like
Yeah.
the history.
Yeah.
We will see that later, or
I mean,
there's
we'll
another
talk about
chapter?
more or less the harmonization in practice, but both of the books do a really good job of
Yeah.
laying out the advantages
Yeah.
and disadvantages. So it's less interesting for me to say the same.
I suppose that was like, well, I already read that. Okay,
Yeah. So I can spend less time on that.
and more thing explaining.
on other
And
things.
the news, like the news. Those are just examples that we will have in class,
Yeah.
like to be more interactive.
Yeah,
and things like that?
exactly.
Okay, it's not like necessary to study them or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hey, yeah. Yeah, no problem. It's SN RB BT.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Have a good night.
You too. All right. Hey. Yeah.
I know it's not your jurisdiction, but can you please have, if I mail it to you, can you have a look at it?
I'm happy to take a look. Yeah. Yeah.
Or so I can mail it to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Just email in the first second.
In the first line.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll mail it. My name is Soumya and Das.
Okay. So I can't necessarily, but I'll happily take a look and give you views.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, and it is. Yeah, it's not easy.